limited, delegated, and discrete powers of Congress in the Constitution. Stay with me on this and take a quick look at them. This is directly from the Constitution itself. The Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, to pay debts, to provide for the common defense and the general welfare of the United States of America as a country, to borrow money, to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes, to establish a uniform rule of naturalization, to coin money and regulate its value, to provide for the punishment of counterfeiting money and securities, to establish post offices, to promote the progress of science and useful arts, to constitute courts inferior to the Supreme Court, to define and punish piracies on the high seas, to declare war, to raise and support armies, to provide and maintain a navy, to make rules for the government and the regulation of the Army and the Navy, to provide for the calling forth of a militia, to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, to exercise exclusive authority in all cases over the District of Columbia, and to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. That is it. These are the limited, delegated, discrete powers that the Constitution gives to the Congress. So how can the government take over health care and still comply with the Constitution? Joining me now in Washington are Tim Lynch, director of the Project on Criminal Justice at the Cato Institute, and in Virginia Beach is Jay Sekulow, chief counsel of the American Center for Law and Justice. Jay, first to you. I guess
yes, sir.
If we were to ask somebody from Congress that had actually read the Constitution, they would say that their authority to regulate health care comes from the Interstate Commerce Clause, the power of Congress to regulate interstate commerce. But when the founders wrote that word regulate, didn't they really mean to keep regular, to make sure there is commerce between the states? What do you say?
You're absolutely right. And, Judge, I had a feeling you were going to ask me that. And as a good lawyer that litigates before courts all over the country, I was going to also let you know that if they would read their own legislation, you know what's missing? The word Commerce Clause. It's not even in the bill and the various bills that are being proposed. So they don't even pretend to rely on the Constitution. Rather, what they're doing is a policy of social engineering under the guise of legislation, and they'll come up with theories about constitutional analysis. But at the end of the day, you're absolutely right. To say that the healthcare industry can be taken over by the United States government under the Commerce Clause or any other provision of the 17 enumerated powers you just mentioned is incorrect as a matter of law and unconstitutional, in our view, as a matter of strict constitutional law. Period.
Tim Lynch, I suppose that if I went from one part of Manhattan to another to visit my doctor, I'm obviously not crossing any interstate lines, I might be able to argue that there's no interstate commerce involved. But the Congress and the lawyers that the Congress would hire, and maybe even some judges would say, well, let's see. The doctor that you went to medical school outside of New York, and the medicine that he gave you was actually made in New Jersey. And so because he once left New York and the medicine came from New Jersey, there's interstate commerce involved. Now, as ridiculous as this sounds, is it not the case that these are the types of arguments that the government has made and that the courts have accepted when trying to justify abuse of the Constitution, where Congress wants to regulate anything that moves?
Yes, unfortunately, it's true, Judge. Attorneys do go into court to make those kinds of arguments. But the bottom line is, I agree with you. Let's be clear about this. The Constitution does not authorize the federal government to establish a public health care system like the one that they have in England or the one that they have in Canada. There would have been no reason to lay out those specific grants of power that you rattled off if the Constitution authorized Congress to establish whatever policies and programs they thought would be in the best interest of the country. There's no reason they would have laid that out. They laid out those specific powers because they wanted the federal government's powers to be limited, and they wanted the federal policymakers to focus on those limited tasks. But the key point, I think, for your viewers is that the Constitution is incapable of enforcing itself. If members of Congress choose to ignore the Constitution, then it falls upon the people to exert pressure on Congress. Somebody once said, Congress only, it's only when Congress feels the heat that they see the light. So if people want to make their voices heard, they need to exert that pressure on Congress. But if the people become apathetic about the Constitution and their freedom, then the rule of law and their liberties will erode, and there's already been too much of that already.
Jay, you know the Constitution as well as any lawyer I know. And not only are there only those 17 powers that I enumerated, but there's a couple of backstops in there. There's the 9th Amendment that says the fact that we have given these powers to Congress doesn't mean we've taken anything from the people. And there's the 10th Amendment, which says
that's right.
What we did not give away, we retained for the states. That nobody talks about those anymore. Just 7 months into its term in office, the Obama administration, just like the Bush administration before it, is acting like it never heard of the Constitution. Just as President Bush allowed spying without warrants and incarceration without trial, President Obama wants to control the salaries of private businesses, change the provisions of private contracts, nationalize insurers and auto manufacturers, and dictate to every person in the land what his or her medical choices shall be. This is theft of liberty and theft of property. Is freedom a reality or a myth? Are the rights guaranteed in the Constitution real or just a pretense? Wasn't the Constitution written to define and to restrain the government? As Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas once said, to keep the government off our backs? If the answers to these questions are no longer obvious, it is because we now have a federal government whose only self-acknowledged limitation is whatever it can get away with. The government is interested in two things: power and keeping power.